let me tell you all about how I learned Spanish. And I think that as I talk about my journey learning Spanish, I think that we can all learn from my mistakes and the things I did right. And so I think that this will be a very useful video for all of you. By the way, this video and my other videos are made for English learners. So if you're an English speaker and you just randomly found this video because you want to learn Spanish, obviously you're welcome to stay and listen to my experience, but just know that you're probably going to notice that I'm talking a little bit more slowly and I'm enunciating probably in a little more exaggerated way because my channel is for people who are learning English. But you're welcome to stay and watch the video, even if you're not an English learner. But most of you are learning English, and I think that one of the best things that we can do as language learners is learn from the experience that other people have had learning whatever language, okay? I've talked about my experience with Spanish in some different episodes, my podcast episodes, and in some different videos, but I don't think I've made a whole YouTube video about this topic, so I'm doing that right now. And if you say, well, I've already heard you talk about learning Spanish, well, it's good to do repetition and hear people talk about the same thing when you're doing your listening practice because it helps you solidify certain words or structures or phrases in your mind. So sorry if you've heard me talk a little bit about this before, but I'm going to talk about it, okay? So let's talk about my Spanish learning journey. I started learning Spanish not seriously, but I had a couple classes in college when I was 19. I was 19. That's when I started. Of course, I had a couple classes in high school, which were pretty pointless, so I'm not including that. In college, I had a couple classes. I learned a little bit. I definitely couldn't speak. I couldn't have a conversation with someone in Spanish. And it was at that point, when I was 19, that I went to Mexico for 5 weeks. I went to Guadalajara, and I enrolled in a language school, and it was part of a homestay program in which I stayed at the house of this older Mexican couple. So I heard them speaking Spanish to me. I couldn't really say a whole lot to them, at least in the first couple weeks, but I had them as a resource, and I had my school at which I studied for 5 weeks, okay, for maybe 5 hours a day, Monday through Friday. That was nice. It was cool interacting with other language learners, people who were learning Spanish. I had a lot of fun in Mexico during those 5 weeks, but the significant event that happened when I was there was that I met my wife. Of course, at that time, she was a stranger to me, but I met her at that school, and 3 years later, she became my wife. For 3 years, we were in a long-distance relationship. I lived in the U.S., and she lived in Mexico. And this really is the base, the foundation of my Spanish learning. I was dating a Mexican woman, okay? So when I met my wife, my Spanish was still beginner level. Like I said, I couldn't have conversations in Spanish. So I would say some things to her in Spanish, but really I had to speak in English when I wanted to get my point across, okay? And she spoke some English to me, but then kind of little by little, throughout those 5 weeks. I think she ended up switching almost completely to Spanish or mostly to Spanish. And then when I left after those 5 weeks, we agreed that we were going to date. And at that point, in my mind, I said, I am going to learn Spanish, okay? And so she didn't talk to me in English after that anymore. We talked on the phone basically every day, almost every day throughout those 3 years. So we would talk for maybe an hour, hour and a half, maximum 2 hours sometimes, probably on average somewhere between an hour and an hour and a half every evening or whatever, okay? So I was forced to use the Spanish that I had and build upon that and talk to this person who I was dating in Spanish, okay? This was very hard at the beginning. You can imagine that, right? Of course, after those 5 weeks of that language school that I was at in Guadalajara, obviously my level increased. So it wasn't like when I first met my wife, because I met her on the first day of school. So that was when I was really bad at Spanish. After those 5 weeks, I had learned a pretty good amount. So I could, kind of start to have, conversations that weren't deep or whatever, but definitely not enough to feel comfortable in a relationship with someone, and I have to speak that language with them. That was, of course, very hard, even after those 5 weeks of language school. But I did it because in my mind, I wanted to build my relationship with this girl and eventually maybe marry her, which happened, obviously. And so I dedicated myself to speaking as much Spanish as I could with her. I basically spoke Spanish until I couldn't finish what I needed to say or whatever, and then I would either say it in English or look it up. I always had my translator. But basically, I was speaking Spanish to her, and she was speaking only in Spanish to me, except if she needed to translate something because she spoke better English than I spoke Spanish, okay? So, like I said, it was very hard at the beginning, but my wife was very, very patient with me, okay? Every time that I didn't understand something that she said, I would literally interrupt her, stop, what did you just say, right? So we would be having a meaningful conversation, and then she would just have to stop and help me like she was the teacher and I was a student. So you can imagine how much patience that took from her. And thankfully, my wife is one of the most patient people I've ever met. So, I chose the right person, right? So she was a really good teacher in that aspect. There were a lot of things that she said that I couldn't understand, and then she had to translate them, or I did. She had to repeat them, and then maybe the next time she said the same thing, and I still didn't understand. So, that can be frustrating, but with someone who's really patient, it's much easier. So it was very hard, as you can imagine. It took a lot of patience on her part, but I was able to fill in the gaps of my speech and my comprehension extremely well. Why? Because I had no choice. I was not doing this as some game or, just she was a language partner that I was exchanging languages with. No, this was my girlfriend, and I wanted to marry her. So I had no choice but to be able to say every single thing that I wanted to say in that relationship. And I had no choice but to understand every single thing that she wanted to say to me in Spanish. I had no choice. So this is not a normal situation. Obviously, 99 point whatever percent of you guys are not going to have this situation. So you might have a language partner with whom you exchange maybe even a few times a week or every day or whatever, or a friend who's helping you learn English or whatever. But that's still not the same as dating a person with the intent to marry them. I was not doing that. I was not dating her just to kind of, all right, I'll just, do this for a little bit. This will be a good story to tell in the future, how I dated a foreigner. No, I wanted to marry her. That was my goal. So that is really like the biggest motivation you could ever have to learn a language, or one of the biggest motivations. Okay. So I had no choice but to fill in all of those gaps of my speech and all the gaps in my comprehension. All right. If I didn't know how to say something, I learned how to say it. And then maybe I forgot it the next time, but I looked it up again, or I asked her again, and then I said it. Eventually, I learned how to say everything or almost everything that I wanted to say in a relationship with someone, right? And I learned to understand almost everything that she said to me, okay? So I did this much faster than the average language learner, okay? I probably reached a level where I could say that I could have an easy conversation with my wife, no issues, maybe just, I might ask her what a word means or a phrase means here or there. But I was able to reach that level of being able to easily converse with my wife, at least, after just a few months, honestly. And that is very fast. I don't want you to think that that's normal, where you just learn a language for a few months and then you can just converse very freely and date in that language. That's not typical, okay? I already had a base. I had done some Spanish prior to that, and of course I had that 5-week course, which really helped kind of give me a good head start. But I went from the level of not really feeling comfortable having a conversation with someone to I could easily talk to my wife for an hour, no problem, in just a few months. That's very fast, not because I'm good or because I had an amazing strategy or method. It was just purely the fact that I had no choice. The motivation was so intense, and there was no other option, so it just happened, okay? So that was a very fast transition to, okay, now I can talk, I can speak freely with my wife, I can basically use native content because I'm using my wife, who's a native speaker. She wasn't slowing down when she was talking to me. I was able to reach that level fast. And you might be wondering, well, does that mean that we as language learners should have like a talk early approach? Some people say you should start talking from day one, talk as soon as you can. Other people, like me, I'm more kind of on the other end of that. I'm not on the very extreme end, but I have the philosophy that I want to understand what the person is saying to me before I just kind of dive in and start talking to native speakers, okay? Because in my experience with students, when they come to class and they can't understand me, it's a hard class, right? But if they come to class and they can understand me, but they can't speak well, easy, no problem, right? We can navigate the conversation easily because I'm an English teacher, right? But when they can't understand me, it's extremely stressful for the student, and it's stressful for me because I don't always speak that person's language. Sure, if they speak Spanish or Portuguese or French or something like that, even like Italian, we can kind of figure out what they're trying to say pretty easily. But if they speak Arabic, right, if they speak Mandarin or something, I got nothing. Like, I can't help them understand me. I can't translate what I'm saying to them, right? So I come more from that philosophy. However, I have to admit that my approach with Spanish had some obvious benefits. Why? Well, after a few months, I could talk to a person fluently in a conversation. That's very fast, right? I'm not talking just like, oh, how was your day? It was good. What did you do on the weekend? Like, I dated a person. Like, we talked about deep things, like you can imagine, right? So, I kind of had a talk early approach, but not really. So I'd already had Spanish before then, as I mentioned, right? I wasn't starting from scratch, okay? I had a pretty decent beginner foundation. So that came before I ever talked, right? And so for that reason alone, I didn't talk that early, right? It's not like I talked right when I started learning Spanish. Number two, as I already mentioned, my motivation was so extremely high because I wanted to marry this person that kind of supersedes, it kind of cancels out some of the negatives of a talk early approach because my motivation level was just so high, right? And number three, my wife was unbelievably patient with me. She's an extremely patient person, even to this day, right? She is really patient, and that's not the average person. The average native speaker is not going to have the patience to have an hour conversation with you and literally answer all of your English questions and let you interrupt them while they're speaking and make them repeat things 3 times. Like, the average native speaker has no time for that. They have no interest in that. Sure, an English teacher, yes, but not just the average person that you're going to talk to in English, right? So my wife was extremely patient, and that helped me talk early, right? And so I guess all in all, it was very different in my case. Like, my case was very different from just the average person learning a language. So you have to keep that in mind. Also, me personally, I pay a lot of attention to detail, more so than the average person, more so than the average language learner. So I really made an effort to correct my own mistakes. My wife didn't always interrupt me and tell me I said things wrong. Like, I had to discover that or ask, hey, was that wrong or whatever. I put a ton of effort into that. And the average learner doesn't do that. I know this. I've taught thousands and thousands of hours of classes. The average person learning English doesn't pay as much attention to details as maybe I do. That's just kind of my personality, let's say. It's not necessarily a big positive or negative because there are some negatives to that as well. It's just kind of who I am. And so that helped me fill in my gaps more by talking early and asking so many questions, interrupting her so many times. That's not what the average person is going to do, right? And lastly, I had tons of chances to correct my mistakes. I talked to her, for hours and hours, every week. I had the chance to repeat things. We talked about the same things, and on many occasions, I would just repeat things during the same conversation. I had tons of opportunities to correct my mistakes. The average learner is not going to have as many opportunities. You might take English classes twice a week, and maybe from one class to the next, you've already forgotten which mistakes you made in the last class, right? I had a little bit more, I had a different approach, and I have a different personality, and I had tons of opportunities. So all that you got to take into consideration. So all of that allowed me to overcome the challenges and the pitfalls of a talk early approach. Okay. I think that approach can work, but there are some big things you got to consider, some potential negatives, and I was able to negate a lot of those negatives, but there were still some things that were negative for me. Okay. I still hold a little more to the belief that unless you have a situation like I had, it doesn't hurt to wait a little bit before talking and just kind of build your understanding a little more. It really makes things a lot less stressful when you start to converse with people, right? I'm doing this with French right now. When I talk to my French tutors, I understand like everything they say. There are a ton of things that I don't know how to say, but it's not a problem. As long as I understand them, the class runs very smoothly, right? When I had Greek classes like 4 years ago, I took classes before I could understand Greek well. And oh man, I would just be sweating so hard in those classes. It was just so stressful because there were so many things that I couldn't understand that they were saying, and I didn't want to interrupt them every time. Hey, I didn't understand that. Repeat that. That's stressful. So I still hold to the belief that it really helps you out to wait until you can understand a little better before you speak. But if you want to speak early, go right ahead. It worked for me for Spanish, but I wouldn't replicate that with another language because, as you can see, what I did was very unconventional. Very, very few people will ever have the situation I had, right? Like the perfect situation to talk early and learn a language really quickly, right? So I got to look at my notes or other things I wanted to say here. Okay. Let me talk about some of the bad things about my approach. I didn't do any listening practice outside of my conversations with my wife, right? That was a mistake. So what happened was I got really comfortable with my wife's way of talking, her slang, her expressions, her way of speaking. But I had such little practice with other types of Spanish that later on, when I moved to Mexico and I felt like I was completely fluent in Spanish, no problem, I still had trouble understanding a lot of the things other people would say to me because I had done so little practice listening outside of my conversations with my wife, right? So even if you have a situation like mine where you're dating an English speaker, you're married to an English speaker, you have a huge advantage, but it still pays dividends. It still really helps you if you do a lot of listening practice with other people besides the person you're dating or you're married to, okay? So that's a big lesson, right? Do a lot of listening, even if you have a situation somewhat similar to mine, right? So I learned that was a mistake later on when I moved to Mexico. When I moved to Mexico, like I said, I couldn't understand other people as well as my wife, obviously. I could obviously still operate and, live in Mexico, but I had to kind of catch up with all the expressions and slang and, things like that I just never heard because I didn't do listening practice. And I was terrible at understanding when in groups of people, especially people that maybe I didn't know or whatever, I wasn't accustomed to their style of speaking, I realized that I had a big gap there. Like I was good one-on-one, but if you put me in a car with 4 other people, it's like I'm trying to follow the conversation and just struggling. Of course, I understood most of the conversation, but there were significant gaps where I'm like, oh, I don't know what he just said, so I'm kind of lost now. That took me a while to overcome. I had to do a lot of practice to overcome that deficiency. I basically spent almost every weekend or every other weekend with groups of people, and I spent a significant amount of time with them, and just like practicing understanding what they were saying, right? So I would see people on the weekends. I got that practice in person. And I think it was probably after like 2 years maybe where I felt like I was just super comfortable anywhere you put me. Like put me in any group of Spanish speakers, unless it's like a dialect that's just so hard to understand or whatever. But, put me in a group of Mexican Spanish speakers and I'm good. That probably took me a couple of years after I was already fluent in the sense that I could talk to people one-on-one. I had done no practice listening to more than one person talking before I had that experience in Mexico. During the 3 years that I was dating my wife, I listened to her talk, and that's basically it, right? So I had like zero experience listening to conversations people had in Spanish, right? So that was a big mistake. I had to overcome that and, get a lot of practice in after, I had already failed to do that. And so it was kind of weird. Like I was fluent in Spanish, when I moved to Mexico. Like anyone that talked to me would say, oh yeah, this guy's fluent in Spanish. But just the group settings would just be really stressful for me. And so I still didn't practice like my listening when I was in Mexico, like with videos or podcasts or whatever. So my only practice with groups was when I was actually in those group settings. So like I said, once a week or a couple times a month. So it still wasn't a ton of practice, but it was enough where maybe after 2 years, I was like, yeah, I'm fine now. Like in any situation, throw me anywhere, put me anywhere, and I'm good. So that was a big mistake as well, not using content with more than one speaker prior to moving to Mexico, right? So from that point up until now, many years have passed. And besides listening to my wife, and obviously that kind of improves my listening, she talks only in Spanish. Besides that, I haven't actively learned Spanish for many years, okay? It's not something I'm doing. I don't consider myself a Spanish learner. I haven't considered myself a Spanish learner in many years. And I started learning other languages years ago, and I've focused on those other languages. So I really haven't had tons of improvement since that point, like 6-7 years ago. I'm kind of forgetting the timeline here, but I haven't really had a lot of improvement. I still learn words and phrases because I hear my wife say them or whatever, or her family say them. But right now, I'm no longer a Spanish learner, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I don't have a super high level in Spanish. I am advanced, and I'm fluent, of course, but there are plenty of people that have learned Spanish to a significantly higher level than I have, and they're still learning. I have, friends, for example, who are learning Spanish, and they're motivated, and they're probably going to pass me up eventually, even though I have a Spanish-speaking wife, because I've no longer, I have no more motivation to learn Spanish. I'm learning other languages at this point. So let me just kind of package this up with a few takeaways from my Spanish learning experience. Number one, motivation is by far the biggest key. It's not even close, okay? Motivation will help you succeed even with a bad method, right? So, of course, the method is like number two after motivation, probably. But motivation for me is just like way more impactful because I had a method to learn Spanish that was mediocre, right? I didn't do any listening practice on my own. I didn't watch things in Spanish. I didn't do any reading. I've never read a Spanish book, I don't think. I didn't do any of that. I didn't do any practice outside just talking to my wife, right? That is not what I would recommend you to do today. That is not a good method. However, my motivation was so incredibly high that hour and a half, or whatever, 2 hours that I would talk to my wife every day became such a valuable lesson. I was absorbing so much. I was learning so much in terms of speaking, listening, just phrases and words, all of that, grammar. That was so valuable, not because my wife's the greatest teacher in the world or because I'm the greatest learner in the world. Of course not. It's because my motivation was just through the roof, okay? Motivation will help you succeed even if your method isn't that great, right? Because ask yourself this, for me, if I didn't learn Spanish, there would be serious consequences in my life. If I hadn't learned it at that time, I probably wouldn't have gotten married to my wife, right? That's a serious consequence. So, when you are thinking about your motivation, you can ask yourself, if I don't do this, if I fail to do this, what is the consequence? And if the consequence isn't that bad, your motivation is probably not super high. You're probably still motivated. Like, I'm motivated to learn French, but if I don't learn French, very little changes with my life. So it's not nearly the same thing as when I was learning Spanish. My method learning French right now is much better than my method learning Spanish. I know so much more as a language learner, but because my motivation is so much less, I am not going to learn French nearly as fast as I learned Spanish. Okay? That's the biggest key. If you only learn one thing from this video, that's it. Okay? Another takeaway, do a lot of listening practice. Listen to more than one person speaking as well. Trust me, I'm speaking from personal experience. You don't want to have the feeling that you're fluent and then you come to the US for like an exchange program and then you're in groups of people with a lot of English speakers and you're just like, this is so hard. It's a terrible feeling, right? So listen to content with more than one person talking. It's so much harder than listening to one person, but it's necessary, okay? That's why I have my US Conversations podcast, all right? So there's a reason why I created that podcast, because I'm thinking about the fact that I didn't use that type of content when I was learning Spanish, and that was a huge mistake. So if you want to listen to my conversations with other native speakers, the link is down below. A couple more takeaways. Fill in the gaps of your speech and your listening by having meaningful conversations with people and just saying what you want to say. If you can't say what you want to say, fill in the gap. All right. I was trying to say this and I couldn't. How do I say this? And that's a very meaningful way to fill in the gaps, because you wanted to say something, you couldn't, and then you found out how to say it, and now you can say it, right? Same thing with your listening. You can't understand the person, but it's a meaningful conversation and you really want to know what it is that they said, and you look it up or you ask them and then you figure it out. That's a meaningful way to fill in the gaps, okay? Speak consistently when you're ready. I wasn't ready, but I overcame this because of my motivation. And so that's a different story. But for you, when you're ready, speak consistently, okay? Do it as much as possible, as frequently as possible, okay? Find ways to do this. If you think of my situation, I talked every day to my wife, and really, that was huge. If I had talked once a week to her, I would have a completely different story for you today, right? I talked to her every day. That frequency, that consistency was just super key. And lastly, try to correct your own errors. You should rely only on yourself for this. Don't rely on a teacher to correct all of your errors. Of course, with a teacher, get correction, get feedback. That's what teachers are for. But really, you are the one that has to fill in the gaps, okay? You have to make it a point to correct your own mistakes, study the things that you said wrong, and learn to say them right. If you don't do this, the process is much slower, right? You'll still improve even if you're not really focused on all your mistakes, but it's much slower. I paid a ton of attention to my mistakes when I was learning Spanish, and that helped me learn faster, okay? All right, that's it. This video was a little bit long. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a lot from my experience learning Spanish. And I encourage you to use my U.S. Conversations podcast so you can listen to multiple people talking, right? I talk to different people every episode. And so you get to hear a lot of different types of, ways of speaking and all of that. And so the link to sign up is down below. Or if you just want my advanced podcast episodes, then that link is down below as well. All right. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll talk to you in the next one.